Hello, folks, and good morning. Welcome to a bit of a thing here, a bit of a story. So the other day, I got two questions from a new viewer that were essentially asking to, well, cover two ideas. First of all, kind of where I started with the series, what's my personal history with it, and second of all, what is it that actually makes this series special? Is the tagline of it essentially being the crown jewel of the genre? Is it warranted? Which yeah, let's go ahead and kind of cover that a bit. So, starting off with the first thing, I actually started this series not even directly appreciating it, believe it or not. I actually started with the general idea of the series quite a bit sooner than ever even playing a ogre game, as I call it. And to me, when it comes to the kind of Ogre Battle series, the Tactics Ogre games, or the Ogre series, as I like to call it, to me, it's more of a collection of ideas rather than one particular series. So, like for example, in my mind, it's not just Tactics Ogre, it's not just Ogre Battle. It also includes things like Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, the Tactics Advanced series, newer ones like Fell Seal, or even the newer XCOM, believe it or not, and even things like Triangle Strategy, though that's oftentimes why I end up criticizing it so much. But let's kind of back up here a little bit. Where did I start with all these games? So, I actually didn't have a whole lot of RPGs growing up. Basically, it was whatever stuff that my brother could put together in the cul-de-sac that we lived, and like whatever he happened to have on hand. So we ended up having this computer he put together from I don't even know what. I just assumed he was some kind of techno wizard at the time. Basically, all throughout our childhood, he was always building me computers. But anyway, so he ends up building this computer, and then we also had a NES. And so that NES wasn't around for a very long time, but we started off like, the old original Zelda. I'm not even sure if we even had anything aside from the original Zelda now that I think about it. But still, point being, we kind of had what we had at the time. Weren't exactly the richest family on the block, so to speak. So it was kind of whatever he could source, more or less. So anyway, the first RPGs I actually played were actually off of another rebuild computer a couple of years after that. In the form of two DOS games. So it was Robotech Crescent Hawk's Inception, which is basically this old DOS like SRPG with permadeath mechanics, where you basically could technically save at any time, but it was very story heavy. There was a lot of interaction with the world and all that. Like you wanted to build up your weapons, you could go fight in the field, or you could just go pay for seminars and training camps and all that kind of thing. Or you could try to get by with your day jobs, or you could go invest in the stock market, that kind of stuff. So, it was just one of those cool cases of like, there's a lot of neat stuff going on here, even if I didn't really understand it at the time. Honestly, that one didn't hold up particularly well, because you can softlock yourself very easily by literally any one of your party members dying, and it being the one that you need to progress the plot. But anyway, it was a cool game, and believe me, this is going to be relevant in a little bit. Anyway, so it was that and another game called Avalon. So basically, that one got me appreciating, things like world interaction, seeing things like, characters building up their skills individually. But at the same time, there was only a small set party. You really couldn't do too much crazy stuff in that game. You could customize your robots and things, which that love of robots definitely carried over to how much I ended up appreciating Armored Core and things like that down the line. But at any rate, at the time, it was what it was. It was just kind of neat. I didn't know what was going on, but I just loved it. But the next DOS game that I really loved was this little indie game called Avalon, which, funnily enough, the guy that made that still has a YouTube channel at this point where he puts out music that he's just kind of made on old sound chips and stuff. It's cool. So anyway, that's a Jer Dareward. If you've ever seen me, kind of throwing out their stuff every now and then. But this was an old indie game that had some pretty incredible music for this old chiptune thing, and it really got me into this mindset of like, wow, some of these games can have some really good music. But I really appreciated the setting in that one. I kind of appreciated the little details that would go into just kind of the settings in general, like just the fact that you spent an entire chunk of the game just kind of getting your ass whooped and having to go climb a mountain. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The balance was certainly questionable, and it was a pretty grindy game, but you know, it was a very interesting experience. So anyhow, this all ends up going on for a few years. And ultimately I end up getting into, like pretty much every kid in the 90s, all the Pokemon games, and, you know, get just kind of enlightened into this idea of, like, you know, wow, there's a lot of potential party members here. It's cool being able to customize your team. It's cool, you know, being able to build all these things. And then you compare it with all your friends, and it's like, you know, this is your own personal thing. You've gone and personalized your team. This is you. It's like basically the equivalent of people taking excessive amounts of Facebook quizzes at this point. But still, it was, you know, that idea that, you know, it's kind of a reflection of yourself in a way, and, you know, a way to identify yourself to other people and all that. Which, yeah, in the 90s, it was a way more, you know, way more kind of a novel thing. So, anyways, so, you know, this goes on for a while, and they end up adding a lot more concepts. Don't worry, I will get into how this all ties together with Tactics Ogre. But this, so over the years, I end up seeing a few RPGs here and there. Like, I think the very first time I ever saw a, you know, full-bore RPG, kind of, sort of, was when I was visiting one of my brother's friend's houses. And he was there playing Legend of Dragoon, and I was seeing them, like, throwing out all these combos and everything. You know, looking back on it, all of the yelling out combo names and stuff is pretty cringy, but you know what? That game is really damn fun to play. Anyway, so I'm looking at it, I'm like, you know, all these people have numbers around them. I don't know what that means, but I'm fascinated. So yeah, it just seemed really cool to me, and so a little bit after that, we ended up finding that game for the cheap at a Sam's Club. And yeah, like, my brother and I just played this thing endlessly. Like, by this point, the FF7 craze had come around, and we both tried it, and surprisingly enough, both didn't really care for it that much. I was curious about it, but for some reason, it didn't quite click. All right, thinking back on it, like, honestly, if my brother had ended up liking that one, I kind of wonder how surprisingly different life would have been up to this point. But, you know, I was a little kid, my brother didn't like it, I didn't like it, you know, as a result, and so ultimately we ended up shelving that one, but really liked Legend of Dragoon. Really liked the kind of good execution of simple concepts. So, you know, just instead of just an attack, you know, you have people throwing out kind of rhythm-based combos, and you occasionally have little counters. Instead of just spamming your items, you're limited on your items, and there's really only so much you can do, but you can get some interesting effect out of said items with a little bit of creativity. And there actually was a really good run that somebody did that I would really highly recommend. There's a guy by the name of Casp who did an item-only run of that game, and man, the humor in that one is just top-notch. The the joke about the volcano, honestly, still ends up popping into my head every now and then, and I just chuckle. But okay, back on track, though. So I actually only first got into a Ogre Battle game with Night of Lotus on the GBA. So I missed it on the PS1. I never really had a SNES, but I did finally end up you know, running into it on the GBA. And funnily enough, it wasn't originally even intentionally kind of a goal, so to speak. So basically, when I was looking through Legend of Dragoon as to how that became relevant, I kept trying to find other games like that. It was like, you know, I like this idea of figuring out how to make the numbers do things. You know, I like this idea of these kind of crazy fantasy worlds and things. And that's when I was looking through those recommendations, and they're like, you know, there's a new one that came out. It's called Tactics Ogre. I'm like, oh, this looks pretty cool. And I look at the screenshots, and I'm like, oh, this is really colorful. Ooh, it's on the Game Boy. I have one of those. So, you know, I was really excited, and then proceeded to look for it for like a month, basically looking for any reason to trick my parents to go to the mall, convincing them there were school supplies there and all this other thing. But I could never find it. Until finally, like, one day my dad kind of picked up on what was going on there. He's like, okay, what do you actually want at the mall? I'm like, well, there's this game I'm looking for. It looks really good. And well, anyway, he took me there. Still couldn't find it, you know. So finally, you know, one time I see a similar recommendation Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm like, this looks pretty cool. So so I go and I check it out and absolutely adore that thing. So I love the music, I love the presentation and stuff like that. The walking animation to this day, I will, like, whenever I'm going and walking with the kids and stuff, whenever we're walking to the park, like, I will still just kind of picture that walking animation completely on accident. It's like the overall vibes of that original PS1 version, which I'll explain why I'm specifically saying, the PS1 version later. But the overall vibes of it were just absolutely top-notch. So I ended up loving that one. We were going on this kind of cross-country trip where my brother, once again, jury-rigs this small TV into the car, and so I ended up getting my first experience of, strategy games on the road by going and playing FFT, off this this little CRT jury-rigged to the center of the car. And so I'm loving that whole experience. Like, it is really something else. It's really just doing it for me. And so yeah, after finishing it, I try going back to it, and I'm like, well, there's really not much else, is there? You go through it, and you can go through it a second time, but nothing's really changing. I tried different choices and things like that for the, 2 choices that you get to make in that game. And even when going through it a second time, well, nothing's really changing, so I've kind of just experienced this, and so I end up shelving it at that point. Fast forward a little bit, we come back, and once again have quote unquote saved up my lunch money by starving at lunchtime in order to be able to get Tactics Ogre, because I'm like, eventually I have to run into this thing. Like, there's no way it just doesn't exist. Because, I was kind of starting to lose hope at that point. And then finally, I end up going to the mall one day, and sure enough, there it is, one copy on the shelf, sitting off in a corner by itself. There's a decent chance that it actually was there previously, and I just never found it. Because, again, they only had one copy. So anyway, I was absolutely ecstatic. I end up, buying the thing on the spot, end up going home. And I'm listening to the music on the way back. And initially, I was very confused, because, again, we're hopping from, FFT's absolute just legendary slapper of a soundtrack to a bunch of beeps and boops. And so it really confused me, to be honest. I had no idea what was going on. Did I completely misjudge this thing? I kept looking at the pictures, and it looks very pretty, and I like it, and it's making me happy just looking at the pictures, because it's a very colorful game. So anyway, I keep going at it, and again, initial disappointment, but oh my goodness, once I started going with it, once I started getting that feeling of wow, you really can do a lot of stuff with your party here, it's very simple to execute. You want to have a different party, you just go and change it. There's really no major complications required here. It felt really, really good to me, and so I kept going into it, and noticed that even the little chippy music was really starting to kind of explain itself, so to speak. Because this is when we kind of get into the core thing of what I consider a Ogre game. Where it's essentially taking this legacy of the one game that we haven't even touched on yet, and basically kind of putting all of these mechanics, all of these worlds and whatever else, in service to the setting at hand. Alright? So, for example, in the case of Night of Lotus there, the music, at first, doesn't seem like anything that would blow you away, but once you listen to it for a while, you see that it's basically perfect for the setting. It's supposed to be a sad setting. It's supposed to be a dreary place. And it's supposed to be just kind of something that gives you more questions than answers. Like I've mentioned countless times by this point, when I think Night of Lotus, I think of, putting units out on the Ron C map, with that echoey kind of rare used battle theme in the background that just sounds like somebody playing bagpipes through some kind of pixel filter off off on the other end of a cliff or something. And it's a weird feeling to explain, but that is what the series is to me. This amalgamation of different ideas that basically force inject you into the setting. So let's continue on here. So with the GBA one, I ended up loving the the party building. I ended up absolutely adoring the just the amount of stuff that you could do. You know, the way that customizing your units felt really good and snappy. The way that it felt like everybody was always capable of doing their job. Like, it didn't feel like your units were, you know, just numbers. They felt like they were people. They were earning emblems as they went along that allowed them to kind of be customized further. Their gear always showed up when it was used, and it felt good just kind of seeing that in the field, you know? And so all these little details ended up combining to a feeling like it was very tangible. So this continues on for a little while. I end up loving that game, like, easily playing it through dozens and dozens of times, and, you know, going through it as I usually do with more and more different challenge runs. So when I'm going through and challenging running all these different games, it really isn't for the purpose of, you know, hey, look at this cool thing I can do, is epic gamer kind of thing. It's really more of a, I want to see how far we can stretch these mechanics, and I want to see what'll cause this thing to break. It's really more active product testing than, you know, necessarily showing off, because there's some of the most dumb runs I've never actually made a video for. But like, for example, right now, you know, level 1 is a bit of a trip, but as you can see, it's also a bit of a slog. Anyways, so okay, so I love the ideas there, but I can't really find anything to scratch that itch for quite some time. I end up running into a few YouTube channels covering a few different games that sort of do for a little while. So, for example, for a while I was watching this guy called 1F Jeff that covered this the series called Silent Storm. And, yeah, absolutely adored watching that one. I ended up finding Kikoska through some of his XCOM videos back in the day, and ended up liking a lot of the stuff that he was showing off. And I just loved exploring these different, different interesting concepts, but I could never quite find anything that completely scratched that same itch. I wanted to be able to be worried about the characters on screen. I wanted to be able to, to kind of experience these big dramatic worlds and whatever else. And every time that I looked it up, people told me that there were more ogre battle and strategy ogre strategy. Wow, I can't brain today. Tactics Ogre. There we go. So people kept putting posts online like, you know, these other things exist, but you're not going to find them. So, and it was a little bit of a bummer on that one, but all right, whatever. I understand. So, okay. So I figured I was never going to see the rest of the series. Maybe it's something I would get a hold of one day, but at the time, I had no idea how to make that happen. So, okay. So at this point, you know, I'm going back and still trying to somewhat get that custom party feeling from a few other games. Again, the Pokemon games got very close, and I'll explain why mechanically once we get to Tactics Ogre PSP. But then I kind of get into this full-on for Armored Core thing for a while, and then ultimately, one day, I go online and somebody's talking about Tactics Ogre getting a remake. And the only Tactics Ogre I've played up to that point is Knight of Lotus. I'm like, you know, it happened. They're remaking my baby. It's here. And didn't realize at the time that they meant this one. And then once I realized that they meant this one, I got even more excited because suddenly it meant that this thing that I had never gotten to experience was experienceable. So fast forward to the day of release, it's given pretty much no marketing. They have a couple of trailers that come out exclusively if you're searching for it. It never ends up getting on the front page. It just like quietly comes out on PSN, doesn't even show out in the new releases section. You gotta go, look for it just through the search bar and things like that. It was the weirdest release. Like, they were just quietly putting this thing out there because it was too much for the world to handle. But anyway, so, oh, shoot. Accidentally shot the wrong guy. No, that's a misclick. By the way, fun note on Tactics Ogre PSP. If you ever misclick, if you just tap L and redo your same turn, like if you misclick a tile, it actually has a feature in there that it will not count that as a chariot usage because you have simply corrected a misclick. So, fun little detail there. Anyway, moving on. So Tactics Ogre Remake comes out, and it honestly got on my nerves at first, because I looked at it and I'm like, I don't recognize any of this. I don't see my my old character builds I can put together, because bear in mind, I was like power playing through Knight of Lotus at this point. But I didn't understand what was going on with this one. It was very complicated. Actually, you know, I just noticed I completely glossed over one of the most important parts of the story. Okay, hang on, we are taking a step back to talk about Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Because you know what? I had a similar feeling before Tactics Ogre there when it came to FFTA. So, like, growing up, my experience with this kind of Ogre series, as I call it, was basically going through Night of Lotus and FFTA side by side on a Game Boy SP in a rat-ridden house. It's kind of experiencing the smell of old chips and you know, rat poop and all that kind of thing, and yeah, just basically going through these two games back and forth, kind of trying to experience a different world, so to speak. Which this is kind of a needlessly dark take on that particular setting. It's not like early on, it was pretty nice. We were in a sort of middle class area. Everything was all well and good, but then basically after 9/11 happened, stuff financially went completely down the tubes, and so yeah, let's just say that a lot of stuff got real depressing real fast. I didn't see my dad most of the time because he was off on the road. Occasionally would essentially get pulled out to go out on a road trip myself, which I absolutely hated at the time. It was, you know, essentially parents drank, all that kind of thing. It was not quite the happiest time. So was more than happy to essentially escape to another world there. So with FFTA in particular, it sort of became this idealized other place kind of picture in my head. Because at the time, I would be, like many kids in the 90s, was like going through and reading all the Harry Potter books and everything else, and I was like, you know what? This other world where you get all kinds of powers and everything else, this sounds great. I kind of want that to be real. You know, as most kiddos did. But obviously, you know, that's a little bit difficult to achieve. But then when I was playing through FFTA, it's like, here's... For context, by the way, I was in Florida, so I had seen snow exactly once when I was taken up north, but here I'm seeing this setting, which is weirdly relatable, because, you know, basically you got characters whose parents are also drinking and getting into financial problems. You have all these kids sitting around, and, you know, I basically similarly had just kind of two friends that would occasionally come by and visit and all that. And so it was this very relatable setting of like, man, you know, I wish I could be in the snow. You know, I wish I could be in this idealized little house where they got tea that's actually cooking and it looks all nice and warm and cozy. You know, have this thing where you can just kind of walk safely home without being told that somebody's gonna friggin' kill you. We actually turned out to have a serial killer on our street at one point, so that was a thing. Anyway, just Florida things. So, like, FFTA, again, was this incredible feeling of just, like, here's this happy place that I wish that I could visit. Alright, so, that's kind of how it was for me. You know, I ended up nearly 100%ing the thing, accidentally ended up destroying my cart by accidentally dropping it out of the car. It basically got run over while we were driving somewhere. Anyway, so... Ultimately, yeah, this left me with, you know, Tactics Ogre as my go-to. I want to go experience on another world through my squares type situation. So, this remake comes out, and it confuses me. There's so much going on. There's so many different ideas at play. There's all these things I'd never heard of. Almost none of the concepts, I think, at the time, from Night of Lotus still apply, right? So, like, I'm looking through it, and it's like, okay, I can still shield bash things. You know, I love this feeling of shield bashing stuff off of stuff. But I'm using these soldier guys, and they seem to be... They don't seem to work like they did before. They actually do. I was just kind of dumb at the time. All of these skills felt more like FFT in my book, which, again, confused me. I didn't understand how the choices worked. Like, it was, quite frankly, just straight up overwhelming. But over time, I kept having this nagging feeling in the back of my head, because, like, I burned out on it very quickly at first, and then I went back. Like, you know, maybe there's something more there that I'm missing. And then ended up burning out again. Then kept thinking maybe there's something more I was missing. It was very pleasant to play. And then burned out on it again. I was like, maybe there's more I'm missing. And, you know, it kept having that nagging feeling to go back and back and back and back and back. to see what it was that made me want to keep going back. And then ultimately, this actually continued for quite some time, until I started challenge running the thing, and started realizing, like, okay, there's a lot more mechanics here than I'm giving it credit for. There's a lot more little details that I've been missing this whole time. A lot of these little effects on items that I never would have thought to look for. And this concept, keeps expanding and expanding, but I can't really shake that same feeling in my head of, like, it's just trying to be complicated to be like an MMO. That's what I kept thinking at the time. Because this was back during the kind of big everybody wants to be an MMO craze at the time, and, basically, my opinion on it was more or less locked in, and I'm a stubborn bastard. So, this kept on going on, but I still kept challenge running it, but didn't really change that opinion. That was until about 6-ish years ago, where I started going through it again, started doing a few more specific challenge runs for this channel, and started realizing, like, when I was doing no skills, it's like, is the game imbalanced or incredibly balanced that I can go through the entire thing using no skills? Is then I tried going through with skills and Fusiliers, and it was way more difficult. So what does that even mean? Like, what does this translate to? What is this, again, is this great or is this trash? What is this? So I kept having my Pumpkin Jack moment for a moment. And then the One Vision mod comes out, and then Rakes comes out with all of these deep dives into how all these mechanics worked. And it turns out that all of these feelings that there was something more, turned out to be completely validated. Because all of a sudden, we were getting treated to the fact that there was all this background stuff going on, all of these little details, like the fact that there was a 3-part armor system at play the whole time, that stuff wasn't just not working, there was a logic behind it not working, that we weren't seeing characters acting randomly. We were seeing that they actually did fully follow their entire normal trajectory through the entire story. Just all of these little things kept adding up and up and up to add to the appreciation of this whole thing. And so that's kind of when I started making more and more videos on this game, just trying to show off all of these cool things that were getting figured out. So at any rate, this went on for some time, and let me circle back to something real quick here, because I was mentioning earlier the question over whether the Tactics Ogre game in particular earned that title of being like exceptional in its execution, so to speak. And what's funny is that looking back, yeah, absolutely it was. But here's the thing: every one of the games in this series, in this kind of wider series as I consider it, did so in a different way. Like I touched on earlier how in many ways everything is in service to the setting, okay? So like when I was experiencing Night of Lotus, and again, I realize this is different people that make a lot of these different games, but when people understood the concept, it just turned into something absolutely exceptional. But when they didn't, it just sort of became a weird imitation. So like in Night of Lotus's case, again, simple party building, basically giving you the idea that they weren't going for any crazy stuff with the parties in question. They weren't going for kind of insane depth on each of these units, but the units themselves were experiencing their own story. Just looking through their emblem case and whatever else, you saw that they have their own tale. They've been through stuff. They have stories of their own to tell. This isn't just your story. That was kind of the concept there. And so I loved that. I loved that as an idea because, again, it's when you lose a character, it's not just not losing the character that matters. And that's actually partially why a lot of Fire Emblem games tend to bounce off for me. Because the tragedy isn't in the loss of the character. The tragedy is in the loss of the potential of the character. And potentially the story is a lot more interesting with the death of a character. So, for example, that's why I ended up really... that's one detail I ended up really appreciating about the Tactics Ogre game and games in general. Because in many cases, when you were losing a unit, like, for example, if you lost a unit in this or you lost a unit in Night of Lotus, there's more than likely a cutscene that they were going to play a part in at some point that somebody else will now take the place of. Or the scene just won't happen in some cases, but for the most part, the scene changed. It still, like, events still played out. People still tried to continue on. There was still hope of completing the story, but it was different. The mood changed, the themes changed, all of that. So, like in Knight of Lotus's case, like, let's say early on, you ended up losing Ivana for some reason. I don't know how you did that. She's one of the tankiest units in the game, but whatever. Somehow you lose Ivana, right? So when you're first going through the scene, through that game, you have a story wherein you need to find out where a mermaid sanctuary is. But you can't find the thing because they don't really want to work with you because people generally just genocided them and called it a day. So, you're given a couple of options to either hunt one down and essentially interrogate them for the location of the thing, or to try to find out some other way. Now, first time through the game, I ended up just kind of going for that option of trying to find some other way, which ends up putting you on what I think is the best trajectory of the game. But going down the other way, you start to see your main character having a crisis of conscience there because, you know, they need to get their mission there done, but they can't do it without getting their hands dirty. And depending on who's there, the entire mood changes, because if Ivana's there, that's essentially, she's kind of serving as his mentor, so to speak. You know, she helped him out. You know, they're just kind of having a conversation between comrades, so to speak, and it feels like, okay, they're strategizing. But if she died up to that point, instead he has a conversation that's similar but different with a local fisherman, and the kind of, wow, this dude is seriously desperate for some friends vibes that you get off that scene is really something else. The scene itself does not change that much, but you really get the feeling of like, wow, this guy's kind of fallen on hard times. It always struck me as just kind of, I don't know, very palpable. I'm like, man, it has gotten dark. It has gotten dark for him to not have any friends here. But anyway, so let's get back to a earlier concept here. I've explained what the series is to me because, you know, I started appreciating this game more and more. You know, basically I loved the ideas of being able to kind of interact with a story, to have your characters feel like they're off on their own adventure, all that kind of thing. But we never did fully go into whether it earned that title of the crown jewel of the genre. Because what is this legacy that I'm talking about? Where did it all start? So this all started back on the SNES. I mean, technically speaking, it started a little bit before that with tabletop board games, but we're not here to talk about the actual, like, history of the mechanics. See, we're talking instead about the history of the mentality behind these games. So, like, when March of the Black Queen was happening, what exactly is the story behind that game? Is it an SRPG? Is it not an SRPG? It doesn't matter. Like, the actual mechanics of it, while technically a lot deeper than they say, are not really the thing that defines its core concept. See, it's supposed to be this higher concept idea of being able to not just win the war, but win the war with yourself intact, right? The war is not just about you. It's not just about winning. It's not just about the money or the politics or whatever else. If the war is not worth it, then what was the point in doing it in the first place? And so that's what they keep trying to get across. So, for example, many of the bad endings essentially just have everyone point out, like, great, you won all the fights, but the people hate you. Like, you won over a wasteland. You have done the Russian approach. You have created a mess and called it victory. All right? And that's kind of where it all originally started there. It's not the first game to explore that concept, but we'll get more into that in a bit. But it's seeing how every kind of everyday folks, like everyday kind of factions and whatever else, are dealing with their place in this suddenly way messier world. Okay. So, for example, like you got Debonair as one of your characters in March of the Black Queen. What is he even doing there? Well, he will join you if he sees that you're trying to do a good thing, but will basically just allow himself to get killed in any other circumstance, because he's not on board with the war that he got pulled into. but he also doesn't want to support anybody that's on the opposite side unless there's a good reason for him to do so. And you find that you basically find going through that whatever side you end up going for, it's just different people trying to kind of carve out their own little spot in this war that makes no sense. Because technically the whole thing started over a few countries getting aggressive to try to take over a neighbor that they saw as weak because that neighbor was afraid of another war breaking out. So it's this completely needless tragedy that that ultimately culminates in in what you end up doing, deciding a lot of what ends up happening in the region. The whole reason that you end up being in a position to fix all of it is nothing to do with you having super protagonist powers, though. I mean, granted, you have the tarot cards, which are kind of, I don't know how nobody else is using those, but whatever. But it's from the concept that you are essentially, you're just somebody that happens to be in the right place at the right time. Your character is not particularly strong. They're not particularly charismatic in a lot of cases. But how much of their charisma, like you may notice early on, you start off with your alignment and your charisma fairly high. People view you highly. People respect you. But your goal is to keep that. All right? Your goal isn't to become like the ultimate, ultimate talky person, whatever else. You've already achieved that at the start. You can only lose it. So it's, again, this just kind of fascinating idea to me that you start off as good as you're gonna be, but can you maintain that is the real question. It's not can you win. You can definitely win. You can win with one squad in that game if you know what you're doing, but can you maintain yourself? And I love that as a concept. Like, that's the thing. All of these games, they don't necessarily only bring one thing to the table. There's usually way more kind of in the background of those ideas. So again, like March of the Black Queen was about preserving yourself and basically preserving whatever you can possibly preserve out of this war. Tactics Ogre, on the other hand, was trying to take that down to a far more personal level for each of your soldiers. Because all of them have their own story, all of them have their own stuff, but realistically, most of them are not making it through this war. In fact, they give you too many soldiers at the very start because you're probably going to lose a couple in your very first fight. And I feel like in many cases when folks first approached that game, they, again, were trained by Fire Emblem that they would not get more people, that they have to preserve the units that they have, that they can't accept a loss because a loss would be a failure. But a loss is not a failure. A loss is a way of life, and that's, again, one of those concepts that's just really palpable about these games. Because your loss was not simply a loss. It was a necessary loss. It was a way for you to move forward. It was a way for the rest of the party to move forward. Like, yeah, that one guy ended up getting mowed down, but that opened up a flank for somebody else to go in for the, a kill on the unit that killed them. Or potentially, it might just completely turn the game around, and suddenly you do what I like to do in those games, and you realize, like, okay, the unit that killed them, they killed them. But you know what? Somebody has to take that spot. And I think somebody just gave themselves enough of a reason to do so. And so you suddenly send in all your soldiers to surround them with with the biggest shields they got, to kind of sit there and block in the guy until they finally agree to join the team. Like, you send Denim in with 3 shield units, and it's like, yeah, you're joining. I don't care how many turns this takes. You're doing this. You got stuff to make up for, buddy. But it's those little storytelling moments that it shines in. Those moments when you first run into, like, let's say Donalto out in the rain, and it's like, oh, this is a really cool scene. It's cool how even the lightning is actually timed to the music and all that. So it's just really cool that, the scene itself is already cool. But on the other hand, you've also got the fact that your units are, again, experiencing their own story in that process. In the first game, it was just a matter of, they're kind of experiencing through their levels. They end up becoming more kind of inclined towards particular things depending on how you raise them. But they didn't really have a whole lot extra beyond that, so a lot of times it was their gear that told the story of where they'd been. So, for example, I liked to go give out items as trophies based on what people had actually achieved, because the actual item stats, they weren't that different. If you put somebody in a particular class of weapon, they ended up, getting a little benefit out of it. But if you basically the actual difference between a really really good weapon and a really really bad weapon was fairly minor. It was kind of tiny. Like, I think it was like a 5 damage difference between the Notos and just a random sword you got at the store. So either way, the kind of idea was that you could tell people's story through the stuff they had, through the things they picked up, and that's why I believe this was actually an intentional design decision. Because if you, for example, do the standard build, you will have 1 consumable and 3 gear items, but then you use up your consumable, and then when you pick up an item, it always gives you a choice. Would you like to equip this item? And to me, that always felt like the appropriate way to do it, of like, this guy just killed off, like, this enemy unit just killed off, 2 of my soldiers, but, this one random knight went through and carved him through, and he got his unique spear. And it's like, yeah, that guy's going to use that spear now. I don't care if he's not a spear unit. He's going to use that spear now. So it was those little things like that, and the fact that Lucht, above all other games in the series, had essentially mastered this idea of adjusting the story to how the world is currently faring. So based on how reputations are going right now with different factions, depending on kind of the world state, like who's alive or dead or any of that, and that was a complete misclick on my part. I'm too busy talking and not focusing, but anyway, so depending on who did what, people might view you differently, people might be alive or dead, and it would change the scene accordingly. Like if one person was there for one scene, like let's say at the start of Chaos, if Canopus is dead by that point, it's just Dedham and Cashwood just kind of talking the scene out, but if he's there essentially making fun of them. Like, you do realize you're in a war, right? Like, this crap just kind of happens. Like, there's no sense in being down about it. Only the winner gets to rewrite history, so you might as well go try to be the winner instead. And it's like, it's just great seeing that, and then if you compare it with the tone of not having him there, you're not missing content per se, it's just a completely different tone. It's a completely different feel. And the original Lucht nailed that in spades. It's incredible how good the execution was, especially back on the SNES. Like, you feel that game. You feel those settings, or rather, you feel those scenarios. I mean, like, how many games will completely rewrite their story on the fly in order for your particular scenario to make sense? Like, it is completely hard dedicated to making sure that you experience the story that you're creating, and I adore that. I absolutely love it. So yeah, when people say that it's the crown jewel of the SRPG thing, yes, absolutely. And here's the thing, SRPGs, they don't necessarily have to be only about mechanics. Technically, the mechanics from the original surprisingly still prevail to this day. To my knowledge, the whole idea of pushing units around for strategic purposes wasn't even that much of a thing. Like, I can't recall any other games that specifically had that outside of something like D&D, which, again, when I say that a lot of this goes back to tabletop type stuff, yeah, customizing your own story, having your world adjust to your story, achieving strategic goals from really lame things. Like, instead of super moves, like the whole Final Fantasy thing of I just decided to shoot all these lasers and it gave me my AoE move and that's how I took care of that group. Instead, it's like, I put down a barricade over there and I used this other dude to block that guy, and the third guy got, shield bashed off a cliff. Those kinds of things are kind of what makes these games. So just being able to make strategy out of fairly mundane things. Like, sure, they added finishers and stuff like that, but those are far less common. They're more of a momentum pusher type of thing. So now we kind of get into the more mechanical side of things as far as where the legacy of it all lies. So it's interesting because the reason that I kind of call all of these games similar, despite not necessarily having the same teams that made them, not having the same franchise even, in many cases that isn't really necessarily the part that matters. So, like, if we go back to the original March of the Black Queen there, we have those moments where we see that you kind of experience the game in an overhead sense, but you also kind of get this feeling for how your units are doing. Like, when you get engrossed into that game, you get this feeling of, like, you see those 3 squads approaching a city with, you know, kind of just like a medium tier team that you've got there, and you get this feeling of, like, okay, I know exactly how the people there are going to handle this particular, you know, thing here. What support can I give them? You know, like, there's this sort of feeling of powerlessness that comes with the fact that you can only give out certain commands. Like, you can generally tell them to go after squad leaders, you can generally tell them to go after certain things, but it's not just that. You can't always call up your whole team to a particular location. If you have a particular item, you can call everybody to support your head squad, but aside from that, if there's one of your other squads that's just kind of out there, that's like, let's say, out defending some little town on the boonies, and the AI decided that that was the place that they're going to mass all their army, you just get this feeling of, like, you either give up this town or you have to just say goodbye to those units. Like, sure, they'll be back next round, but it gives this very, very, very tangible feeling of, like, you know what's coming. It's not that you don't know what's coming, it's how are you going to handle what's coming kind of thing. So, for example, like, one of the reasons that I criticize Triangle there is for kind of implying that that is going to happen, and essentially kind of betraying you for it. So, like, giving you those moments where when you're fighting the generic units, like, let's say we take that one fight in the Pink Village, and those moments, like, where you're fighting through all the blue faction soldiers, and it's, you know, gives this interesting feeling of, like, you know, they're coming in endless waves, and there's going to be nothing you can do about this. And it's a cool setup, you know, it's set up as this last stand, and then suddenly you see that, like, there's characters that have no business doing the kinds of damage that they're doing, you know, one-shotting units, and you're starting to lose ground on this suddenly, like, you get emotionally invested in this last stand, right? And then you see that you're suddenly gonna have to restart this map because, you know, this chubby nobody showed up and suddenly, like, just sweep the entire team, and it's like, why is that there? And so suddenly you're losing investment because you're getting annoyed at the fact that you have to redo this thing, but then realize that, oh wait, we can just sit here for 30 minutes and cheese it out with the standard cheese units. So, like, it takes this emotional investment and it throws it completely in the toilet, because now you went from, you know, I wonder how the story's going to progress, to, oh my god, these bosses suck. And it does that back to back, and that's when I consider the kind of legacy of these original games, they tend to avoid that for the most part. There's certainly missteps here and there, but for the most part, they tend to avoid doing that kind of thing. So, like, for example, like, one of the things that comes up as a balance thing for many of the Ogre games is the fact that you can oftentimes run up and snipe the boss, but that is intentional. It's in service to the story, it's in service to the setting. You're there, you know, this enemy team, you don't want to fight them, but the boss on the other end, the guy that's leading them, he's just another unit like everybody else. He's there because it's his job. He's not there because he's some superhero. Even when there are super powerful units, you can still rush them down. There's never this, like, DBZ feeling of, like, you know, oh god, they're going to pull out their lasers and then we're going to be in trouble. It's like, no, that's just a dude. That's just a person, you know? So, obviously, you know, different RPG tropes are going to be going in different ways, but I feel like when you're going and you're going to try to get people invested in the story, that's the best way to do it. You make the people feel like people. Anyway, I don't want to get into criticizing Triangle. I do that enough on a regular basis as it is. Honestly, that game kind of breaks my heart for that reason. Because so many times I got invested into the story and, like, I want to see how it's going forward. And then, like, they just immediately turned it around with, like, no, they weren't dead the whole time. It's fine. They're a party member now. Yay, we outsmarted you. Like, no, you didn't. You just pulled that out of your ass. What are you talking about? Anyway. Okay. Let's not get into that. So let's get into back into like, it's kind of good design and all that kind of thing. So when it comes to the strategy of these games, I mentioned earlier, again, all of them will try to make their setting make sense as much as possible. And, like, one of those things that I love is how the classes are completely different in every single game. They have the same general vibes, but they might as well have been made by different companies by how differently they function. Like, for example, basic soldiers back in Night of Lotus. They are the most basic unit with the worst growths and whatever else, and you are playing as Lotus in that one, and, like, sure, they more than likely would just see the basic grunt as something to promote out of. Meanwhile, in Valeria, over here on this one, the soldier is the jack of all trades. They're the unit that's, like, training in the most weapons, but it's going to be somebody's primary career choice in a lot of cases. Because, you know, they're just a basic grunt. They're a basic unit on the field. And so it doesn't really matter that, you know, they don't have crazy, you know, stats or whatever else. The weapons matter more than the stats in this one. Whereas in the original, a unit's career path would have mattered more, and their weapons would have mattered less. Because it was more about them experiencing and surviving the story, and just kind of seeing who could make it through the story. Whereas, for example, in this remake, in many cases, you will look at your characters and it'll be like, oh, you know, this guy has learned, you know, all these different things, and this is their whole story here. Like, they've fought so many dragons that they have all this draconology built up, or they've been practicing this particular kind of magic for so long that they're this strong in it, or they've gone and they've cross-classed a few times, so they have some skills that they technically shouldn't have, like for example, right here we have a basic soldier that knows how to talk to golems. So he's been a caster at some point. So it's just cool to see. You know, like, all the games will have entirely different mechanics, and this is kind of when it comes down to that whole legacy thing, that legacy feeling. This is more of a general idea. Like, again, in no particular order. Well, actually, I guess a very particular order. Like March of the Black Queen, items were just something you randomly picked up. It played like a board game, but the story played like something like, let's say, any of your modern, like, kind of political thriller kind of games. Your, what the hell is it called? Like Age of Kings? Not Age of Kings. What is it? Crusader Kings or whatever else? Like, wherein there's just all of these different people that will react differently based on your choices. But your ultimate goal is just to win the map. But you're still trying to preserve your own main character's integrity throughout all of it. And it can go as badly as you accidentally causing the entire world to get invaded by demons. Like, it can go insanely poorly for you, or it can go insanely well, where you're married and running your own kingdom. And it's actually one of the few games I can think of that early on kind of switched out certain story events based on gender. Anyway, the original Lucht, like, was all about the kind of survival stories of the units that made it to where they did. So, you know, we already covered that one a decent bit, and yeah, like, the story would always adjust. The mechanics were fairly simple. It was closer to to something like checkers than chess, but it didn't matter, because the idea was that it was more about the feeling than the direct balance. Like, you didn't charge your knights in, you put them out in a front line, you let the archers and stuff fire from behind those front lines. When they charged and you countered, that's when you could make your counterattack and push through their lines. It was that mentality of, like, playing conservatively, keeping your people. Those guys have infinite soldiers, you don't. That kind of XCOM feeling, you know? And it pulled that off excellently. Like, many times it's seen that that melee units in the original Lucht are useless, and they're not. They're not at all. They have some of the highest damage in the game, but you use them as a counter and then a counter push. You don't use them as the brunt of your attack. So it's great. Like, you don't attack unless you get the kill, is how I like to usually put that one. And so that feels absolutely excellent. Like, that feeling that all of your people are just kind of doing their job, so to speak. But then, yeah, we get to Ogre Battle 64, for example, which I completely have not covered up to this point. And once again, everything works entirely different. Your soldiers don't even get names. They're trained in batches, and then eventually one of them gets promoted into a fighter or an Amazon. From there, they can promote into other units, but your people are limited. Your basic grunts, you train them in groups, but you're still limited in how many you can get. You're limited in how much money you can get. You're limited in terms of what gear is available to you and where you can travel, but that's the thing. It's supposed to give this feeling of being in a sort of, like, relatively compact area. You're supposed to feel somewhat claustrophobic. There's all these world-ending events going on outside, and when the ogre invasion comes, it quickly sweeps through most of it. But again, it's this feeling of like claustrophobia, this feeling of everybody's kind of familiar to each other because it's a smaller region. Okay, everyone knows each other, everyone kind of gets the general idea, but like it has very solid small town vibes is the thing. And so again, very hard to describe. Like when you build like when you unlock a new class, it's because you found the pieces of their uniform. Like it's a unique thing that only happens in that game, but it makes sense in this kind of small town, everybody's just kind of putting their stuff together concept, you know? They're not a big country. A lot of stuff happens kind of piecemeal there. So it's just interesting to see it all approached from that angle. But again, it's all in service to the setting. Like it just feels really solid. Almost every weird little quirk of that game can be explained somewhere. And then, then we get into something like Prince of Zenobia. That one happened. And then we get into... Sorry, I have not played Prince of Zenobia enough to know or care. It's a spin-off of March of the Black Queen. It's... whatever. Anyway. But then we get into what seems to be like what they're going for Reborn, okay? Because they seem to want to make... And what they seem to have hopefully achieved is all of the above, like all of the original Lucht's like feeling of just your soldiers surviving through this war. They don't have lives anymore. Like if you're wondering why I never explained that one again. I did a video on this a while ago, explaining why the lives mechanic matters for Tactics Ogre PSP. But basically the lives mechanic was there to let you know, like, you messed up. This is how much you messed up. Like this, you've lost this unit twice. If you lose them one more time, they're dead. Like, it's just this constant reminder of your failures. And that seems like a negative thing, but that is the constant reinforcing thing of this game. It's this constant feeling like you are there to get through this whole fight, but how much of, you know, what was originally there are you keeping with you? And how it seems like they're doing this for Reborn is it seems like they're essentially doing a mix of new and old. Like, it's interesting to me that in many ways, there's more lines that can be drawn from Vagrant Story back on the PS1, a Final Fantasy Tactics kind of side sequel, than there are to the original Tactics Ogre mechanically, because the armor system, the kind of augments and racials and whatever else, all of that is entirely from Vagrant Story. The way that the finishers work, mechanically slightly different because they use TP and later on for Reborn MP instead of HP like they did for that one, but still the general idea and actually even the names are basically the same. The break arts became the finishers, and the finishers in concept were something that were started back on the SNES version, but it was an interesting mechanic where it was this dead king that was teaching you all the stuff that his completely overwhelmed kingdom had figured out but couldn't really quite implement. But then in this one, they basically established that no, he survived that war a little bit longer. He taught his soldiers all of these moves, and then the evolutions of those moves basically went along the same line as those break arts in the in Vagrant Story, and basically went out to all of the soldiers in this region, so they just understand how to do this stuff now. So it's just a really cool, like, minor lore change that completely changes the setting. That all these soldiers are that much more formidable because, like, the guy lasted an extra month in the war, basically. So it's just really cool. You know, it's a really, really cool idea. Anyway. So like, yeah, it seems like they're bringing back, like, the FFT death system, wherein you're still keeping the countdowns from this one, but you're essentially down to one life. But like Knight of Lotus, you can quickly train up new units, but at the same time, like Ogre Battle 64, you seem to have the option to more quickly train them out in sparring matches. But then also, like March of the Black Queen, you seem to still have all of those same kinds of story events, but this time, you know, maybe stuff will be different. Maybe stuff won't get as screwed over. By the way, as far as why that's relevant, I'm talking specifically about, like, reputation type stuff, because if you knew how to correctly manipulate stuff in March of the Black Queen, you would not lose reputation. But in Lucht, one of the things that people screwed themselves over for were some of the DLC characters that required a certain reputation with a certain faction, and because of the way that people tended to just go into random maps and blindly grind, They caused their reputation with those groups to drop because the majority population of the island was made of that faction. So, anyway, it was just kind of a funny little detail there. But anyway. Okay, so... Ultimately, did this game end up earning its title as the crown jewel of the genre? I really think so, because there's so many, behind every corner there's another thing to think about. There's a little implication behind every little bit and piece that's going on. In fact, one of those really cool concepts that I love seeing explored throughout the series is people's adaptation to war, or people's adaptation rather. For example, early on, it's viewed that the magic is stronger, but units are weaker. But that's not the case. Their armor is more primitive, but the magic always stays the same. It is consistent. It is the fact that people develop better armor against it that's actually the reason that the end game magic ends up working differently, and why guns end up starting to take over. And it's this interesting thing, like seeing this medieval fantasy world transitioning into this new type of weaponry. And it's like, yeah, I can see why there would be a role for this. Like, if you're min-maxing your way through the game, you may not potentially realize that that's why guns are introduced in the end game. Because suddenly, it's like a rule of cool thing to some degree, but at the same time, it's like, well, they want to have a long-range option that can consistently counter heavy armor. And what's funny is that this actually wasn't necessarily much of a problem in the original, but it's way more of a problem in this one. So it's that much more interesting to see units having to run into this particular situation where they need something to counter the heavier armor of their opponents. And this it feels like something they tried to execute on back on the SNES, but the armor system was a little bit too primitive at that point. But then when it came to the PSP, they were able to add so many more layers of complications to it, to the point where at sometimes it functions as a just standard RPG kind of stat system, and sometimes it functions as a Fallout or D&D-esque armor versus gear system. At other times it's more of a Disgaea-esque, you're working on stacking your scalings kind of thing. It's so dang fluid among different situations that it's just a mechanic that I've always really adored. So I hope I've done at least a half-decent job of explaining some of these concepts here. Again, in general, I feel like when someone says, a Tactics Ogre game or whatever else, to me, it's a game that puts its setting above everything else. It doesn't necessarily have to be balanced. It doesn't necessarily have to be, perfectly pretty or whatever else. The idea is that the story takes precedent. The story, the setting, the people. And I don't mean the people we've created 50 different background stories for this character. I mean the people act like people. They try to do what they want to do. It doesn't matter if it's a great goal. It doesn't even matter if it's an honorable goal. It doesn't matter if they're a complete piece of shit. But you know what? I want them to be consistent in trying to accomplish what they want to accomplish. I love one of the cool ideas that they had back in March of the Black Queen that actually came back in Lucked here. Is the concept of a body snatcher that's kind of a complete dumbass in Albelio. That his idea is he just wants to build an army of dragons. He's not very good at it. He's just trying to do what his boss told him to do. He's just trying to do his frickin' day job, and his day job is to find dragons from somewhere. And so you run into him twice in March of the Black Queen, both times trying to just take over a place to get more dragons. But he uniquely, or semi-uniquely, has the ability to come back to life. So every time he dies, he just respawns, basically. It's just a thing. But the thing is, he doesn't use this to gain some kind of superpowers or edge over anybody else. He's just trying to do his job. He's just doing his thing, So when he comes back in Let Us Cling Together here, you actually might have noticed him in the party earlier. He just spawns in Palace of the Dead. He's like, there's a lot of dragons in this place. And then immediately his party gets killed. So he's just there getting eaten by zombie dragons when you find him. And, this poor bastard is still just trying to do his job, even though it's the dumbest idea he could have come up with. He's actively about to die, yet again, trying to do that same job, but he's just single-mindedly trying to do that thing. When you have characters like Hector that show up in all routes, no matter what route you take, and funnily enough, I've seen this as a bit of a hot take too, he is always consistently trying to do his job. Like if you're on Chaos, for example, you may notice one of the early bosses are essentially his wife. You killed his wife, so he knows he's fighting you. Like you wronged him and you didn't even know him, but the dude understands that and basically is essentially on your side aside from that. So he's in a position where he wants to defect, but at the same time he can't defect because then his family dies, and then his family's like everything falls apart just entirely. So yeah, ultimately he ends up letting himself die while essentially steering you towards, well, something that would essentially help your side in the war. But at the same time, if you encounter him on neutral, like, it's just a tragic thing because you know that you've screwed this guy over. Like, if you're going there through a second route, you've read his backstory, you've screwed this guy. You have ruined his life entirely, and you're about to execute him for something that you don't even know he did. So, like, the entire thing on neutral just basically starts off with, okay, this guy got arrested, he lost, somebody else beat him. He's not unstoppable, you know, he's just a commander on the other side. So the Wallister did eventually overwhelm his position. And basically it's just your job to execute him. Like, he's basically told, like, okay, we respect what you've done, like, we respect the stuff that you've achieved. You're given something in order to attempt to defend yourself, but honestly it's really more just a thing. So, and what's even more is he's not allowed to be put in a position to surrender, because everyone knows he's not allowed to surrender, but his soldiers are. So if he dies, his soldiers already have standing orders to give up. Like, that's the thing on all routes. Whenever you beat him, all of his soldiers, you notice in the background, already have been given orders to give up as soon as anything happens to him. So it's like, I just love that there's so many little attentions to detail. Like, all of the stuff where he doesn't have to be this crazy superpowered unit, you know? It doesn't matter. Like interesting little, for example, the whole thing of making a fight difficult to be difficult, okay? And again, goes back to why I was criticizing Triangle for some of their choices there, okay? Let's take, you got like High Commander Zabos in this one, right? Dude's a faction leader, pretty much. He's more or less one of the top faction guys for the Galgastani. But he's stubborn. He refuses to change, he refuses to adapt. What did Knights do in the original versions of these games? They just fought. They didn't heal. As the game got updated, they got the option to heal. What does he do? He doesn't. He's too stubborn. He doesn't want to change. He doesn't want to have healing abilities. It would essentially make him nigh unstoppable because the guy's got vitality for days, but it doesn't matter. He doesn't want to. He's too stubborn to change. He's stuck in his old ways. It is consistent with his character to make his build wrong, and they do that. Like, to me, that is what this entire like line of games shines on. It's not that they tried to make something challenging for the sake of being challenging. They didn't try to make like particular characters tougher than they need to be. Everyone is as they are. They are simply a person living their life. They are simply a unit just representing somebody just living their own story. So yeah, in his case, he's a major boss. He's still a difficult boss because he's got backup for him, but he refuses to use anything other than the traditional roles for any of these units. It is essentially a character flaw made into a character build, and it's just awesome. Meanwhile, again, Triangle, plucky politician comes up and just one-shots a tank, and it's like, oh, haha, we have made it hard. We have outsmarted you. It's like, no, you've made me pissed off for caring about your story, but that's about it. Anyway, so this is, again, consistent throughout all of it. Like, I love how in some cases you'll see characters that they'll essentially prepare for their situation, but you may not have necessarily realized this. Like, in a similar location up in that snow castle, there's the fight versus one of the wizards there that you might have, like, if you haven't seen the suboptimal challenge, I gained so much more appreciation for the way that unit functions just off of that challenge alone. Because normally what you do is, by that point, he's just a squishy wizard, he's standing out in the open, so you would just fly somebody up and one-shot him with your best archer. Okay, cool. Is it just an easy fight? Normally, yes, but then you realize if he survives past that first round, he had a plan in place. He will retreat back. He will send his heavies forward. His archers will spread out and just kind of start shooting from all over the place. And while Canopus's plans on how to deal with that situation are, quite frankly, a hilarious hot take, the fact that this unit did actually have a plan, this boss unit had a whole plan in that situation that they never get to execute on, just makes it even more tragic. Because again, they're just a character doing their thing. They're just living their life. They're doing what they were told to do. They're like every game in this line has done this, and this is why I include stuff like FFTA and A2 in this whole discussion, because you'll notice that they were a bit more obvious about it there, but they did the exact same thing. Like for example, why is there a character in A2, one of the best casters in the game who would be a legitimate threat that shows up as a boss repeatedly, who intentionally starts off every fight with every debuff that they can get? Why? Because she insists it makes her stronger. It doesn't, but she just believes this for some reason. And, like, granted, it's probably because at the time there were a lot of these really weird health crazes that people have to make themselves suffer to improve themselves. But, like, it's just great to see stuff like that. Like, you see Dragoons come up pretty regularly, and for some reason, they almost always immediately just get completely crushed every time that you go on a recruitment mission for them. And I'm actually not entirely sure if this was intentional, but it always struck me as a sign that they're just an incredibly stubborn kind of class that can only possibly relate to people because they're kind of animalistic. Again, might just be a hot take on that one because, quite frankly, it's hard to tell, and those missions might have just been weirdly designed. But still, it's got a lot of character to it. The balance and difficulty goes up and down throughout this entire series. There's certain maps that are clearly meant to be easy. There's certain maps that are clearly meant to be hard. But the balance changes depending on the story and depending on the setting and depending on the people involved, and that's what I really appreciate about this. I just appreciate seeing that the story will respect what's going on. It's trying to tell you the story. It's trying to get you immersed in the setting. It's trying to get you to feel. It wants you to. It's more like an opera, right? Like, let's say you go to a movie or whatever else, and suddenly like you get like a Tarantino kind of experience where they care about every single little detail, and it's like it's awesome to see that, and it's great when that happens. But then at the same time, it combines some very operatic stuff where a lot of things are intentionally off just to make you feel something. And actually, I think the Tarantino example might be a bit even better in this particular case, because how many times in that guy's movies do you notice that things are either excessively gory or just kind of off or just intentionally wrong just to make you feel something? It makes you feel. This entire series, it makes you feel, and that's really, I think, what it comes down to. It puts the emotion of the situation, it puts the kind of believability of the characters at the forefront. And I realize that I seemingly have something against Triangle, which I don't. I really wish that game would have done this better, because it got so damn close. It really is just something that bums me out when I think about it, because when it does it right, it does it very right. Like, there's those moments when you get into a map and there's no crazy boss units, there's no dumb gimmicks that aren't doing anything, and it's just, you're just experiencing the map, everyone's moving around all fluidly, your characters are backing each other up. Those moments are gold. And then you get to those other moments where they'll kill off a character and then bring them back an hour later, or like they'll give you this whole investment in the story only to decide that this random unit needed too high of stats, and just it makes no sense as you're just sitting there beating this random dude over and over and over and over and over. And it's like, dude, you're just wasting my time. Like the Alvora fight, for example, your big siege fight halfway through, most people had that experience of seeing their units get one-tapped by the general after basically winning the strategic portion of the fight, and then just kind of sitting there shooting from a roof for over an hour. as the rest of the remaining units are completely mentally incapable of taking a single action, because the AI did not know what to do. Now, this isn't, again, meant to criticize the programming specifically. I'm sure there were other reasons for it, but anyone familiar with RTS games, and specifically scenario editors, will have seen this phenomenon before, which is where you essentially, you don't program the AI to do particular things. They already have an AI in place, but you tell them to aggro to a specific point, and they will do that. And that is what Triangle's AI does. It aggroes to a particular point in the map, usually wherever you started the map from, and if you simply walk away from them, they no longer will attempt to do anything. Healers will gladly sit there in place, dying from poison, simply because the unit that poisoned them is invisible, which means that they are not allowed to react. Now, I don't know the logic behind this decision, but I know personally it completely takes me out of the experience. Because it implies that the enemy is not acting in a rational way. They're not thinking about what they're doing. They're robots, you know? And again, I want to care about the setting. I want to care about the story. I want to care about the characters. But if they're robots and anybody with a face, aside from like 4 people, can't even die, where's my investment there? Anyway, the main reason I compare the two is because of the kind of clear inspirations there, rather. I mean, hell, they even have 3 finishers that are pretty much identical to the ones from Night of Lotus. They have pretty much shot-for-shot scenes that are near identical between the 2 games. Even the report section, like pretty much the layout of all the menus and everything else are, once again, almost 1-to-1. It's a really weird one. I've never really kind of understood why it is that one's considered to not be considered inspired by it by many folks. It's pretty cut and dry. It's right there. Anyway, okay, off of Triangle. I hope the PC version will actually finally fix all that stuff, because if somebody fixed the AI and somebody fixed the balancing, that's a pretty tasty nugget right there. Anyway, let's carry on. So, kind of final notes on all this. I should probably go ahead and wrap this up at some point before I go ranting on forever. So to me, yes, the original execution of Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre, with how they pulled off those like adaptive story ideas and whatever else, the legacy of all those things still lives on pretty strongly to this day. The way that you see the kind of story interactions and whatever else, I feel like the best modern version I've seen of that is from Felseal there, with even your generics getting a place in cutscenes. Like the first 2 characters that I made for my Switch Felseal kind of run through was a self-insert of myself and my wife, and it's just kind of cool to see them having dinner in the background while the main characters are talking. It's just cool to see some of the other randos occasionally just showing up, like, oh, somebody's scouting. Okay, who's scouting? Apparently Solid Snake. Who's over there cooking dinner today? Okay, apparently Alphonse has decided to go cook dinner for everybody today. Or you get some people just off just patrolling and doing security, and it feels good, so I really just appreciate those kinds of little details in that. When it came to the most modern kind of take on the mechanics you saw from this one, I mean, obviously Reborn's coming out almost immediately. Good lord, this next month can't happen fast enough. But XCOM 2, oftentimes it gets considered to be its own thing, but it does take many of those same ideas of like you're combining action moves, you're combining the sort of MMO thing of cooldowns, but you're also combining the fact that basically the game will adapt on the fly to how you're doing, and again, all that stuff just feels great. It feels really, really tangible, and that tangible feeling is really kind of the meat and bones of all this stuff, if you ask me. So okay, I think that's all I really want to rant on about all this for now. So, let me know if you guys have any questions. Do let me know if you want to see more stuff like this covered. And, yeah, I can't wait. We're so dang close. Alright. See you next time.